The views expressed on the Final Straw Radio do not necessarily reflect those of Asheville FM, Friends of Community Radio, or any of the affiliate radio stations airing the show. You're listening to WSFM LP 103.3 in Asheville, North Carolina. This is The Final Straw, and I'm Burst of Goodness. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. Also, if you're interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment, you're free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw, care of Asheville FM, 864 Haywood Road, Asheville, North Carolina, 28806. The show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop. This week I spoke with Reed Wildermuth. Reed is a co-editor and founder of the website Gods and Radicals, which also publishes a periodical journal entitled A Beautiful Resistance. For the hour, we speak about paganism, anti-capitalism, race, and whiteness in the context of ethical approaches towards earth-based religions as white people in a settler colonial society. We talk about May Day, which is this week, happy May Day, and many other topics. I really enjoyed this conversation. You can find more of Reed's work and work by folks at the Gods and Radical collectives by checking out godsandradicals.org. Separately, if you're in the Southeast or wherever, you are cordially invited to attend the first Another Carolina Anarchist Book Fair, also known as the ACAB 2017, from May 5th to May 7th in Asheville, North Carolina. The weekend of events kicks off with a welcome table at Firestorm at 610 Haywood Road from 3 p.m. until about 6 p.m., with a schedule of events and pamphlets about how to plug in. There are multiple musical events Friday and Saturday nights. Featured speakers include Sean McFessel, who we interviewed recently about how nonviolence ain't what it used to be. Jude Ortiz of the Tilted Scales Collective, who we also interviewed recently about a tilted guide towards being a defendant. Also members of the Crime Think Collective, as well as people from the Water Protectors Anti-Repression Crew, and a special appearance by author and activist Ward Churchill. Vendors over the weekend will include PM Press, AK Press, Little Black Cart, Strangers in a Tangled Wilderness, Combustion Books, and many, many more. Consider the daytime events to be all ages. You can check out a schedule and all sorts of other info at acab2017.noblogs.org for updates and info.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll call like a
I have had to write this several weeks in advance, so by the time you hear it, the war may already have started, or several wars. It appears the U.S. will soon be at war in Syria and possibly invading North Korea. I have it on good authority that Trump also has designs for Canada. I'm writing this weeks in advance because bursts will soon be unavailable by phone, traveling the world. It's on his bucket list to return to the Irish town that the Oh Goodness family originally called home. And since Trump's election, like every other sane person, he's expediting completion of his bucket list. We could all sputter out at any minute, you know. I'd go traveling around with him, but I've got prior commitments. Because I've written this in advance, I don't know which war we're in. But since when did not knowing what I'm talking about ever stop me from contributing? Exactly. So look, whichever wars we're in by the time you hear this, I've got some fantastic ideas to share with the Department of Defense, and I hope you share my enthusiasm. Feel free to send the Department of Defense lots of emails and letters and calls advocating the ideas I'm describing here. I think all three of them are indispensable to the war effort. Whichever war we're in now, Syria, North Korea, Canada, whatever. My first idea involves the U.S. troops' chemical suits. Wherever the U.S. is fighting, except maybe Canada, protection against chemical attack will be important. The problem is the chemical suits make the troops look like bug-eyed monsters. The chemical masks are hideous and scary. So to make the troops look less intimidating, I propose cosmetic changes to the chemical suits, putting them inside the mascot costumes from Disney World. You know, Mickey, Minnie, Donald, Goofy, Pluto, the whole Mickey Mouse Club. Imagine it. Mickey and Donald. I mean, the cartoon Donald. The cartoon Donald not in the White House. Leading the troops up over the hill. Everyone loves Mickey and Donald. I mean, the cartoon Donald. The cartoon Donald not in the White House. Think about it. Nobody on the planet can shoot Goofy. So U.S. troops need the Department of Defense to start mass-producing big, dumb, furry Disney character costumes. And just as a somewhat irrelevant side note, it's only appropriate that armed Mickeys and Minnies and Plutos go marching in conquest of the world, since Walt Disney was himself a Nazi. Walt and Adolf were like identical cousins. The real Disney World would have been ethnically cleansed. It's a small world after all? Sure is, after you gas everybody. Anyway, that's the first plan. Mickey in Goofy suits. My second plan, Trump's cabinet members hijack a plane and seek political asylum in whatever country the U.S. is at war with. Either Syria, North Korea, Russia, China, Canada. And then, when they get there, they do exactly to that poor country what they intended to do to the U.S. It'll be devastating. That country will never recover. It's like a Trojan horse, filled with ishtads. My third plan, indispensable to the U.S. war effort, involves sending researchers to Loch Ness. With sonar and divers, the U.S. military can get a DNA sample from the Loch Ness Monster, or Nessie as some call it. With that DNA sample, the military can make clones, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, living dinosaurs. What can the U.S. military do with thousands of cloned Loch Ness monsters, you ask? Well, they can cram them into C-130 cargo planes and drop them over populated cities. Do you know what kind of a mess that would make, dropping giant dinosaurs thousands of feet? Imagine the splatter patterns. And the U.S. would have plausible deniability. Who would believe any adversary when they complain to the United Nations that the U.S. is using enormous extinct monsters as munitions? See the brilliance? So now all we need is a collective effort, a mass movement to push the Department of Defense to adopt these plans. No country, not Syria, North Korea, Russia, China, Canada, could possibly withstand a U.S. war effort that includes marching Disney mascots and Trump cabinet members in a Trojan horse and exotic dinosaur clones dropped from bombers. We all have a patriotic duty to promote these successful strategies, whichever wars are happening by the time you hear this. For my part, I've developed a proposal that I've mailed to each of the Joint Chiefs, a proposal that contains a number of illustrations I drew myself, so even a Joint Chief could understand it. Who knows? This contribution to the war effort might get me off the no-fly list. Well, until they actually try it. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from War and Corruption in Lebanon, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can write to Sean Swain at Sean Swain 243-205 Warren CI P.O. Box 120 5787 State Route 63 Lebanon, Ohio 45036. Updates on his situation and more writings by Sean can be found at seanswain.org.
We're speaking with Reed Wildermuth. Reed is an editor and contributor to the blog Gods and Radicals, and a magazine called A Beautiful Resistance. So we're pre-recording this episode to be a broadcast on the week of May Day, which is why I thought it would be prudent to chat with Reed about his experiences of the confluences of radicalism and paganism. Thank you, Reed, so much for taking the time to have this chat.
Absolutely. You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Definitely. Could you tell listeners a little bit about your publishing platform and what got it started?
Yeah, absolutely. So Gods and Radicals is both a website and a nonprofit publisher. We started in May 1st of 2015, so about 2 years ago. And we host articles, almost daily articles on our website. And we also publish several publications, all of it with a pagan anti-capitalist bent.
So why paganism and anti-capitalism? Like, why do those two go hand in hand for you?
Well, to start, I'm pagan and I've been anti-capitalist my entire life.
That's an easy answer.
Yeah, and the rest of the people who write with us have experienced similar positions where, we identify as pagan. We do pagan things, whether that's heathen or occultist. We have a broad definition of paganism, but we're all also anti-capitalist and have never seen any contradiction between the two positions. In fact, if anything, they seem to flow into each other perfectly.
And for listeners who may not be familiar with paganism, when you say paganism, what do you mean?
Okay, so I cannot define paganism for everybody, but I can define my paganism. So usually we mean earth-based spiritualities. Usually they're modern. Whether that is modern Druidry, modern witchcraft, modern occult. There are many traditions that fall into that. But generally speaking, by paganism, I mean a veneration for the earth and an animistic understanding of everything that lives in the earth. Everything exists for itself. Everything has spirit. If I'm going to cut down a tree, it's not my tree to cut down. I'm making a decision to destroy something else that's living. And when you imbue everything with that, when you recognize that everything is living, then you see the world completely differently. So that's what I mean by paganism.
Kind of splitting hairs here. How do you differentiate a pantheist viewpoint from an animist viewpoint?
Definitely splitting hairs here. But most people who are pantheist embrace the idea that God, however they define God, is in everything. So they tend to believe in a unity. We are all part of one great spirit, as it were. Whereas an animist tends to recognize individual personalities. You could almost say it's the communism versus anarchism of paganism. A pantheist kind of lumps everything into one unitary being, whereas an animist recognizes everybody as an individual.
Very well put. Thank you. So, in your mind, what about capitalism doesn't flow or doesn't work with the idea of pantheism, or of not a pantheism, excuse me, but of paganism, of your paganism?
Well, short answer: everything. Nothing in capitalism quite works with this at all. Capitalism, having started, in the 1700s, was the first primary break. Some believe agriculture was, long ago, but it was the first primary break that the modern world saw between relationship to land and relationship between humans. Once land became private property, during the enclosure movement, etc., with the destructions of the commons in England, and then later on through the rest of continental Europe, humanity became divorced from the land. Land was no longer something that we were a part of. It became something that could be bought and sold. And capitalism's primary foundation is that private property, the buying and selling of land, and everything stems from that. So returning to an idea of paganism being an earth-based spirituality in which you are part of the land, and the things that are on the land with you that are in the world exist for themselves. Nothing can be bought and sold that way. That's one of the primary tensions between paganism and capitalism.
And we're talking about a context, or like a mental state that came along with colonialism. It's not that all of humanity was immediately put under the yoke of capitalist ideology at that point, right? It's just
Absolutely, yeah. And in fact, you still see, as Silvia Federici has pointed out, there's still places where that connection exists, that continues to exist, and when capitalism touches it, attempts to marketize all of their existence, that's when you start to see those great conflicts that Europe saw in the 1700s.
it seems like an opportunity for a glimmer of hope right there.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
So for me, I kind of came up around a paganism in the anti-globe era and was inspired by Reclaiming, the project that Starhawk was involved in the Bay Area, because that's where I was living at the time. And so that's where I saw an infusion of talk about the struggles that Judy Berry and Earth First in Northern California were involved with, protecting the forests at the same time as labor organizing with the Wobblies or other unions at the same time as the anti-globe movement or the alter globe movement or whatever you want to call it. So things kind of seem to really mesh really well. And so that's one reason I'm really excited to be having this conversation right now.
Yeah, I actually, my experience with paganism was very similar, and it was definitely during the early 2000s with Starhawk, with Reclaiming. Well, I'm not a Reclaiming witch, and I've never really been a part of them. I have nothing bad to say about them at all. They're great people, and during that time, it seemed self-evident that if you were a pagan, if you were a witch, of course you were anti-capitalist. Of course you were. Against globalization, etc.
And anti-oppression being the people historically that would have been put to the stake.
Right.
So, I guess jumping rails to another rail, a lot of the content on your site that I've seen disseminated on It's Going Down in particular has dealt with white folks in North America embracing a paganism that they bind very closely to their white identity. And y'all have offered critiques of that approach to colonialism and to whiteness. Can you help me unpack what folks like, I don't even want to say folks, God damn it, the people involved in Wolves of Vinland or what Odinists or Votanists or whatever are doing and why you might find it problematic as a pagan?
Ooh, yeah. How does one unravel that? So if we need to begin again at the in the 16 and 1700s when displacement was occurring on European soil, when people began losing their connection to the land, they weren't losing it because they were seeking a brand new life, etc. The American story that we tell is that everyone came over to North America in order to find a better world. But we never talk about what they were fleeing. They were fleeing the birth of the factory. They were fleeing enclosure, and they were fleeing wars that were being created from that what Marx called primitive accumulation. So those people coming in waves across the ocean, the English first with the Germans and the Dutch, and then later on the Irish, the Italians, etc. They were not white. They did not become white, except by a slow process that began in the late 1600s and became reified into law in the 1700s. Before that, they had no shared identity. Their entire identity was one of displacement, and they had no access to the previous ways of living. They're here on this continent, which is being colonized. They have a choice: help colonize, or revolt. And the colonial leaders made it very, very, very easy, much easier for them to side with the leaders instead and continue colonizing. If you took on the identity of white, then you got access to the privileges, as it were, of being a new American colonial settler. In the process of becoming white, and as an aside, both James Baldwin and Frantz Fanon talk heavily about this trauma, actually, the process of becoming white, they lost what little connection they had left to their previous lives. And with that, they became, as it were, blank. Most of them were Christian, and they took on a new kind of religious, political identity, which of course was, colonist, and then later on American. So if you fast forward then, until our present time, we have the descendants of people who were descended from people who became white, and before that they were not white. They were Irish. They were, whatever. All of them are now looking for some sort of way of, to use the word reclaiming some sort of culture, some sort of cultural experience, some sort of religious experience, and some sort of connection to land. What folks like Wolves of Vinland do, Jack Donovan, the Sons of Odin, the rest of them, is they offer a way for white people to reclaim an identity. Now, of course, it's a constructed identity. All of our identities are constructed, and it's a white nationalist identity. It is an identity based on whiteness, which was never something that we were. Speaking as a person who is white, we were before. Like you can't go back and say, the whites in Europe in the 1500s. There were no whites. The idea of whiteness did not exist. So they're engaging in a, it's definitely spiritual, it's definitely religious, but more than anything, it's political. They're trying to claim a political position where whiteness is re-imbued with a constructed romantic identity, which is pagan, heathen, etc. To put that in comparison to what say what we're doing, or let's use reclaiming for an example. Reclaiming has always had the sense that yes we were we are colonizers in North America, but they've always understood that core trauma of capitalism. That's been extended by the work of, I mentioned her before, Sylvia Federici in her book Caliban and the Witch, that the creation of the political category of witch, the people who needed to be burned, that came along with the process of the birth of capital. So reclaiming has always attempted to go back to, but to literally reclaim the territory that was lost at the birth of capitalism. Compare that to what the Sons of Odin and the Wolves of Vinland are doing. They're not attempting to reclaim anything. More, they're attempting to seize.
This is The Final Straw, and I'm Bursa Goodness. This week I spoke with Reed Wildermuth. Reed is a co-editor and founder of the website Gods and Radicals, which also publishes a periodical journal entitled A Beautiful Resistance. just as an example. So I'm a white person. I'm growing up in society. I feel alienated by what's presented to me spiritually, by Christianity or by Judaism or by whatever I'm brought up around, and I feel it leaves me a bit hollow. It doesn't tie me to like the ground, to the soil, to the animals. And so I take the step of, all right, well, I'm going to figure out a way. I'm going to use the words that people have already found and already been sharing, and maybe try to find a practice that I can share with other people through the shared language of like, cool, we're druids, we're witches, we're what have you. So how do you, without attempting to, because we're working off the position that there's a continuing, if like to put this word on it, pagan practice that is tied to the land and that is indigenous to North America, that has been running for millennia, or as some would say, like since the beginning of time. But me being outside of those cultures that practice that, I don't have access without the act of appropriation, which in a lot of ways reflects the, like, just the nature of settler colonial society, is that I come and I take from you and I make it my own. What would be, okay, just to continue this very long question, one approach that people would take is, okay, I don't want to be appropriative of the existing names for the trees and the animals and the land base that I'm on that is being practiced and used in someone's practice. So I will go back to my ancestry and use their names and their practices and those gods and meld my existence with like a consciousness to my being a settler colonial like subject. I've felt this conundrum, and this is one reason that I personally like stepped away from the pagan practice that I was practicing, is that it feels like if I'm following a practice and the books tell me, like Llewellyn Press or whatever tells me that, cool, as an Irish witch, as a witta or whatever, I'm like giving reverence to these specific trees and these specific rocks and these specific animals, but I'm living on a totally different land base. Do you see what I'm getting at? Like a difficulty that I might have with being non-appropriative as a white person and as a product of settler colonial society, but also how would you say, like, what are some interesting ways to build a practice that recognizes that relationship to the land and to the people that are here?
Yeah, I think what happens is that there are actually two things going on at once in your question. And while the political is spiritual and the spiritual is political, I think we need to separate just for a moment the question of building a spiritual practice as the descendant of colonists, as someone still living on colonized, unceded territory, and the act of cultural appropriation, or being a settler itself. So when we look at North America, of course, United States, Canada particularly, those are both colonial states, and they continue to be colonial states. There are places in Europe where many of those people were from that are not colonial states. Now, excuse me, they're not on colonized land. They are, of course, still colonized states. I'm currently in France. France still, is a colonial power. England is the same, etc. But the experience in North America, same way, with Australia and New Zealand, is people who have not quite been able to come to a resolution of the continuing act of colonization, where there is a government that was created from the colonists, the settlers. And it continues to prevent people who were indigenous to that land, previously, from having access to power, which is also having access to wealth, having access to land. That is one issue. The second issue, which is, and like I said, let's keep that separate for a moment, is the attempt to regain something or to get something that is obviously missing in one's life. Christianity does not work for most people, or I'm sorry, it apparently works for lots of people, those who claim themselves to be Christians, but for people like myself, it doesn't work. None of the monotheistic religions do. However, my own personal experience with the land, with spirits, with the dead, with gods, etc., that is what informs the creation of a spiritual practice for myself. I don't claim it to be ancient. I don't claim it to be continuing. It is generally different from what exists with many of the First Nations people in North America, though one can recognize cognates. Now, as I said, these are two separate issues that we lump into one when we talk about cultural appropriation. When we're talking about cultural appropriation, we're really talking about money. We're talking about the buying and selling of spirituality. Under capitalism, we treat everything as a marketable commodity. Therefore, indigenous religious practices, like, oh, I see what they're doing. Well, how do I get that? How do I claim that? I want that. I want to own that. Oftentimes, the people that the appropriation is occurring to don't even look at them in with a sense of ownership. It's like, well, that's what makes sense in this context. This is part of our society. They don't cut up. They don't enclose their spirituality and then sell it off piecemeal. And so when a white person in North America particularly attempts to build a spiritual practice by taking from the practices of the First Nations people, they're usually just grabbing a piece, and they don't realize that those things are not inseparable from the entire culture. As a white person, you can learn you can learn all of the spirituality that a First Nations group, a First Nations tribe engages in, but you have to become a part of the tribe, or you have to live with them. Like you cannot learn it out of that context, but they will teach you. I've known plenty of people who are like, oh yeah, we'll teach you, come live with us. And that's different from our fear of, our fear and our valid critique of, the theft, stealing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I'm amazed that you were able to avoid using the term commodity fetishism or.
Yeah, well, and that doesn't actually we could use commodity fetishism here for a second, except in this case it is the whites who are fetishizing a commodity, in that case, that like, oh, this is the core currency of their spirituality, let me claim that. No culture, no spirituality can be reduced to a product. The dream catcher, one thinks of the dream catcher like, oh yeah, like, look, this is native spirituality. It's like, well, no, that's like a tiny aspect of native spirituality that where'd you get that? Did you buy that in a store? Oh, okay. Well, that's kind of shitty. But I think if it makes sense, like I feel like there's been a dogmatism particularly on the American left, liberal left, when it comes to attacking cultural appropriation. Yes, theft of cultural artifacts, of cultural practices is bad. Property is theft as well. Like, and that is turning what they what others do into property that we can just take and use. However, the dogmatism comes in when we talk over the First Nations people who are actually saying anything about this stuff. Like we're like, oh yeah, no, we can teach you that, but you have to come live with us. And that dogmatism, I think, has opened up a way, or excuse me, it's opened up a breach. The white nationalists wedge into that breach and say, hey, look, Indigenous people, First Nations people, they can have tribal continuity. Those are closed societies. They, no one should be taking from them. Therefore, we, white people, or them, white people, we can do the same thing. We can be exclusive. Like, we can exclude people who are not part of our white tribal society, as it were. And they're only able to employ that logic because of a fault in a dogmatic fault on the American liberal left when it comes to questions of cultural appropriation.
And that fault is the presumption that societies are closed, or the allergic reaction to commodification.
Wow. So how do I describe this? So it's both. First of all, yeah, there are no closed societies. When you look at you see this within paganism. There's a lot of there's a purity politics in pagan practice where, if you are not from this specific ancestry, you should not be worshiping this god that was worshipped by the people who were 200 miles away from where you're from. Or you should not be mixing pantheons, etc. You see that a lot, and most of it is we've created this mythic idea that cultures existed as pure, never-changing, closed systems. Whereas, if you look at on the Thames in the United Kingdom in London, there's an old temple to Isis. Isis was an Egyptian god.
Really?
Oh yeah. Actually, and another good example in Paris, France, there was a temple to Dionysus where Montmartre is, where the film Amélie was filmed. We tend to look at, in those cases, we cannot say that was imperialism. We can't say that the English stole Isis from Egypt. It's that Isis colonized, as it were, or Isis was brought by Egyptians and others who had been worshiping her in the South. Like, where do you draw the lines there? Where do you say this god is allowed to be worshipped by this people but not by that people? And when you look at ancient history, that it was never the case. So there is a problem. The white nationalist urge, especially the esoteric fascist urge, is to create a new pure religious system, oftentimes within heathenry, that is true to our ancient ancestors, or what they see as their ancient ancestors. There was no such thing. There was never such a thing as a pure, continued line like that. Simultaneously, though, I think the liberal left makes the exact same mistake when we look at cross-contamination, as it were, or cross-pollination of indigenous ideas into white settler culture. One could just as easily say that the First Nations are recolonizing the colonizers. And in fact, I think a lot of the movement towards re-indigenization, a lot of the post-colonial project, has been coming from colonized people trying to heal the trauma of the colonizers and in a way recolonizing them back into the land that they now exist, and saying, hey, while you're here, let's teach you how to use this land. Let's teach you how to be with this land, and let's teach you how to not be awful any longer.
Yeah, nobody likes being awful.
Right.
we sometimes just don't know how to not be awful. With you talking about the temple on Montmartre, which actually like was a center for the communards too, so to think that Dionysius or Bacchus or whatever was like some sort of power underneath the mountain, just like, yes, be free, share, wine, orgies, whatever. Like,
Yep, absolutely.
and what you're talking about also reminds me to tell listeners that by the time this airs, the probably crappy, but the TV series based on Neil Gaiman's novel American Gods will have aired, which I thought was like an interesting approach towards this sort of conversation of people taking their gods and their spiritualities with them, and those gods being different where they developed in the different colonies or the different communities than maybe the one that, like, the Odin that's over here is maybe a little bit different from the one that's over here, or the one that's,
Yeah, well, and we see that too anyway in European gods. The Bridget is a great example of a goddess who was worshipped in multiple places, and she has different local iterations. But and that's no different than the Catholic syncretization of gods and saints. And they kind of had no choice in that matter, I think, because what it looks like is the veneration of her had been so staunch that without recognizing her existence in some way, the Catholic Church would have really not been able to maintain a foothold.
Yeah, they would have been pissing in the wind.
If you look at the way that certain saints appear in certain areas, they're always clothed in the spiritual artifacts, as it were, or I like to say just the land. They're clothed in the culture of the place where that saint is worshipped. But that same saint will be worshipped in a completely different country and will look different.
European practices, discussion of May Day. This episode, like I said, is going to air on May Day, or May 1st, which is an important date for anarchists, tying back to at least if nothing else, the Haymarket tragedy in 1886, but beyond that too. Can you talk as a radical and as a pagan what May Day means to you, and maybe, if you want to, how you're going to be celebrating?
Yeah. Are you familiar with the writer Peter Linebaugh?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Peter Linebaugh has a great book, and I always get the adjectives wrong, but it's a true, incomplete, authentic, and wonderful history of May Day. And he sees both a red and green current that has always existed in the celebration of May Day. I love it, and of course we call it Beltane, but it's pretty seeing that it's also this day of springtime uprising, as it were, or actually first day of summer, in our calendar at least. This uprising that is like no, we're going to clothe ourselves in beauty and flowers and enjoy everything that exists in the world. We're not going to work. We're not going to accept tyranny over us, etc. I've always loved that connection. The fact that it's right there. It seems that is the perfect spot where anarchy or anarchism and paganism merge, or at least meet. That's the crossroads. John O'Donohue, who's an Irish Catholic priest, he was also a Marxist and Hegelian. He had brought up that on May Day in Ireland, long before the 1800s, May Day was the day that you planted eggs in your landlord's land, or your neighbor's land, in order to spoil his entire crop for the entire year. It was a day of peasant revolt, long before it was a day of anarchist worker revolt, and the fact that that tradition, that angry revolt tradition, goes far back and then merges, at Haymarket, and then continues to this day. Like I think Beltane is beautiful. I'm not sure how I'll celebrate it this year. You know, as I said, I'm in France, so I'll see what they're up to.
And Peter, we actually I got to talk to. I pluralize myself sometimes when I'm doing interviews for some weird reason. I actually got to talk to him about the book from Mayday's show last year, so that ties in nicely. But one of the really important things, especially with the current administration in the United States, I think that he kept bringing up from that interview, and that was in the book, was talking about in the mid-2000s the immigrant struggles and the large marches that were happening, the Day Without an Immigrant, and huge shows of solidarity. And if we look back at the, at the Haymarket too, those were all the eight and all the people that were in the, like so many of the people were in the crowd, they were immigrants. They spoke German, they spoke Italian, maybe not, but Polish, and they were not treated as white at the time. I think it's awesome that current, the fact that seeds get blown around, and people are the seeds, and it's the beginning of spring. How do we flourish and how do we flower together?
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Let's see. That was actually it for the questions that I had. We have a few more minutes. Are there any subjects? Are there any things that are coming out on Gods and Radicals that you're excited about, or?
We're still pretty excited about the recent issue of A Beautiful Resistance. This is the first time we did public readings of it, and they were really well attended. It was quite exciting. One of the things that I've been personally working on is trying to reclaim the idea of that left sacred. Our ideas. I mentioned purity politics before. There's this notion of the sacred being something that is pure, something that is clean, something that is separated out from everything else. There's always been in almost every culture a parallel sacred, which has been named the left sacred. That's the degenerate sacred. That's the rotting sacred, the decomposing sacred, the messy, hybridized, the stuff that you separate out of society as well. And with the rise of fascism now, there is this new obsession with purity, and it's even affected particularly American social justice politics, where are you exactly the right identity to be able to be talking about this subject? If not, well, let's test your purity. So it's infected the liberal left as much as it's being pushed by the fascist right. And against that, we propose the return of the left sacred, the mix, the hybridized, the white and black mixed together. I thought about that a lot. My former partner was black, and it was walking around with him in a very racist place, and yet still being able to see, oh wait, there's a lot of mixed race couples here, and a lot of mixed race children, and watching that, realizing that mixing is what so terrifies the fascist drive for purity. It seems like we need to mix. We must mix. We must spread ourselves everywhere and become everything and hybridize and become the messy, beautiful revolution that we can.
So how does that differ with the attempt to control and to spread everywhere? Because there's that impulse that's in our society, and that maybe is the right sacred or the fascist sacred that you talk about. But what can you talk about the difference between power over and power with?
Yeah. So I think that comes I mean, we apply it to the fascists, but it's also most of our identity categories, most of our ideas of what something is, come from the government, the powerful, the capitalists, the empires need to categorize. It needs men to be men and women to be women. It needs it needs heterosexuality. It needs whites to be separated from blacks. It needs all of that. And we reproduce those categories, even in our attempts to transcend them. We still reproduce them. And the answer we've forgotten is like I said, that mixing. We cannot. We'll never have clear definitions, and in fact, our need for clear definitions, our need for pure packaged culture and politics and ideology is what keeps us from ever creating, solidarity movements. I think, as I said before, the idea of colonized people infecting, colonizing or recolonizing the settler culture. That I think is the lesson that we need to go with. That's the power with. Letting others change and constantly challenge the dominant white idea of what things must be, how things must go, what a revolution must look like, what resistance must look like, what our spirituality must look like.
Well, Reed, thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes,
This is The Final Straw, and I'm Burst of Goodness. Yeah. This show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. Also, if you're interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment, you're free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw, care of Asheville FM, 864 Haywood Road, Asheville, North Carolina, 28806. The show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.
Construyendo una familia basada en la confianza y en el respeto de quien son los nuestros. Que aguantar con mirada de impotencia como el sudor que derramaste por mano. Que las hostias repartidas han perdido su sentido, dejando a un lado lo que está por el